Hi, my dragons. Welcome to Tuesday's class, the 26th of January, where we're going to hopefully finish the intro for victimology. I will put up a forum question for you to answer to take care of attendance. Make sure you do that when you see it so that your financial aid and your scholarships and all that other stuff is counted in for your attendance for the university. All right, so we last left off at critical victimology, and I was talking to you about how important critical victimology was to the overall victimology movement in terms of, trying to decide what is a crime, what should be punished, what should not be punished. Does that evolve? Does it change? And so we're looking at other things that developed the field of victimology. And there were some things, so a lot of times things that are happening in society, of course, that spurs research. And then those things become evolution points for the field to develop. So we had this happening. We had changes in the society that made things move along in the academic study of victimology and with practitioners, so the applied victimology. But all we're concerned with, the victim in society and the victim's well-being. So several movements that were happening at the same time where we were trying to get victimology as a really good field, and the victims movement was something that really motivated the field to develop. And there were 6 different sorts of things that were motivators. So the first one was the women's movement. This is in the 60s and 70s. And so then the women's movement happened. Basically, there were things, there's always been stresses for equality for women. So things like, the suffragette movement and things like that. But this was basically things like equal pay for equal work, the rights of women as litigants in court, women as victims in court. We're going to see some films later on where it'll actually surprise you the way that women were treated in court. A second thing that happened was a children's rights movement. So children, the Constitution didn't even apply to children for a very long time. And children's rights are something that are still evolving and still shocking when it comes to things that are happening in the country. For instance, like when you went to school, things that schools did that were basically illegal. And that's the question we ask. If it were anyone else of any other age or any other type of person, but it happens to this group of person versus another group of person, should that be illegal? So that's the whole system, the whole idea of juvenile justice. Like you can't do one thing to young people just because of their particular status. And in most cases, we're talking about age. So you can't tell students or kids, you can't say that when anyone else has freedom of speech, so they should too as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the children's movement, which is still evolving. There's a lot of abuse that still happens to people who are, not of legal age. Then we had crime rate concerns. So crime rate concerns, we had people who are very nervous about, the level of crime in different cities and different regions. And so we wanted to, try and curtail crime when we saw it. So that became a movement in and of itself. And then a thing that it's surprising, so many people still don't know is a thing today, and that is victim compensation programs. So you can be compensated if you're a victim of crime by the state. And a lot of people don't even know that the state has money put aside to help victims of crime when they need help. And there was also legal reforms associated with victims. So a lot of times victims, had an outcry about, I can't believe the system is treating me this way. And they petitioned to change the law, which, in the United States, you have the power to change the law if you don't like something. And people forget that along the way. They just think, oh my God, that's such a big thing, I can't do it. But literally, you do have the power in your hands to do that. And then there were a variety of other factors that fall under the title of miscellaneous. We'll talk about that as well. So let's start with the women's movement. So there are many things that women put up with that today we would never put up with, completely sexist things, like in the 1950s and 60s. That's when society began to, it was always with us, let's just put it that, it was always with us. But by the 50s and 60s, women were like, okay, enough of that. So they didn't like when they were when they went to trial, to talk about a wrong that had happened to them, especially a victimization, sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, those kinds of things. And, they were treated badly. They were questioned. They were all of these things that happened. Their offenders got off, and nothing ever happened to them. I'm going to show you a film on that too that you just absolutely will not believe. Landmark cases that, today I show them in classes, and students are like, oh my God, that's the way it was. Yeah, that's what your mothers and grandmothers put up with. So we'll talk about that as well. So the women got together and they demanded changes in the criminal justice system, and they made really good progress. It doesn't just help women, it helps everyone in society as well. And they developed different programs that had never existed before as a result of this, like crisis centers, rape centers, domestic violence shelters, counseling that was specifically tailored for those individuals with specific type of crimes, such as, for intimate partner violence. It's not only women too, so it benefited the whole family. Children's counseling for children, and testifying, things that we even do procedurally in court that changed because of these different movements. Then the children's rights system, child abuse has always been with us, always, 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 and regarded as not a crime. Okay, so some famous cases like London Bridge is falling down. It used to be a practice back in the day, historically, where they would take a child and encase them in cement and put them in a building like London Bridge, cornerstones of churches and things like that, because it was lucky, and these are children that nobody wanted. So we decided, no, that's not right. Let's have some children's rights. And so they had advocacy and things like that back in the 60s. So 60s was really big. We had people radiologists who discovered that there was such a thing as, child abuse, that should be the abused child as evidence in a courtroom. So it's been around for a long time. It's still hot topics today. There's always a push and pull, again, with kids in school and what the schools can do, what the kids' school can't do. I told my students all the time, when I was a kid, we didn't do it in our school because I'm from Massachusetts, and in Massachusetts, they were just like, no, we don't do this. But I remember I was in graduate school in Tennessee, and I was at a party, and I was talking to some people, and I met this man, and he's like, oh, I'm in charge of paddling. And I foolishly thought that he was the coach for like a canoe team or a rowing team or something like that. But no, he meant paddling children, like hitting children. And that was legal in the United States for a very long time. It was shocking to me because we, as our state, had abolished it. But, can teachers do that? And all of these different legal topics, So that was the children's right movements. So we saw the development of children and family services, child and family services, a lot of different family-friendly kinds of things, and a lot of different reporting things on child abuse, a whole big thing. Then the concern with crime led to, in the 60s and 70s, so as you can see, the 60s and 70s were a tumultuous time. If your parents or grandparents are alive and you want to say, hey, what was going on in the 60s and 70s, they'll probably talk your ear off. But there was a lot of crime research and a lot of reporting. There was a lot of funding for that sort of thing, too. So there was a spike in crime during that era. And it had been doubling, so the crime rate was going up. Now it's very low. That's another thing people don't realize. Like, the crime rate is so low. So if you hear some politician on TV going, the crime is out of control, that's a lie. The statistics do not bear that out. And you should, stand on the side of the research. Basically because our population is getting older, and generally crime is a young person's sport. But we'll talk about that in detail later. So it became like a political candy to talk about the crime rate. We're going to talk about the crime rate, and we're going to get a handle on this. So President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, appointed a commission to study the criminal justice system, and a big part of that was, let's look at the victim issues, okay? So this was a famous commission called the 1967 President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. You might see it by the acronym LEAA. And this was a very good start that looked at everything systemically. Boy, we need that again today. So it was highly funded. They had a bunch of researchers go in and try and analyze all the bits and pieces of the criminal justice system to try and get a handle on what was happening, what were some of the abuses, what can we improve on, what can we do for victims, like for pain and suffering and loss, what kind of community programs can we establish, what kind of victim services and victim compensation. And there was a greater call for victims to be involved in the criminal justice procedure. So it was really a really very nice wraparound for everything. They really looked at everything. And then 15 years later, they did another study to look at the wraparound to see, had these things that we talked about changed, improved? Did it matter at some of the stuff that we threw money at? Did it really help the system and all of that? So that was very cool. Then we had a movement to advocate victim compensation programs. Now, victims compensation, it seems very progressive, let's put it that way. It seems like a very progressive idea that we should the state should try and do something to give money to victims of crime. One might argue that, hey, we have a civil justice system that will take care of that. Yes, we do, but then people are not able to access the civil justice system as easily as they could if something were there where they could get compensation for the things that had happened to them, and they didn't have to have a big, broad legal knowledge, and that if they went to the police department, that the police department would help them, or if they had a victims advocate. That was another program that came out of this as well. But victims compensation, so still today, people are unaware of victim compensation programs, which I find really interesting. I'm going to put the rest of this on the second video because there's a lot to talk about here, and I don't want to run out of time, which I see we're running out of time. So stay tuned for part 2.